Hello, my name's Amanda Foxenhill and this is Suddenly Autistic, the video diary where I am talking about the sort of topics around autism as I'm finding them, as somebody who was diagnosed as autistic around 2 years ago, just under 2 years ago. So my diagnosis came later on in my life, hopefully not at the end of my life. I hope I'll live a lot longer, but by this point a lot of things have happened and there's a lot to unpick and unpack. What I'm going to talk about in this video is one of the theories of autism that I'm learning about now formally, and when I say formally I mean that I'm applying my scientific brain and my ability to read and dissect scientific papers, at least to some level, to the theory as opposed to what I've done prior. So I have made videos, a couple of videos about monotropism, and those are very valid. I felt they were helpful to myself. However, those videos were based on my understanding or my conception of monotropism before I'd read the theory. Now this sort of thing is the kind of thing that usually drives me nuts when I see people talking about something that they clearly have no idea about in my professional field, which is cosmetic science. What I'd say about that is the following. So as I got my autism diagnosis at the age of 46, after spending nearly a year going through the process with a psychologist and unpicking everything about me, that the conclusion of which being that I'm actually autistic, it's a very tiring process and a very confronting process, very thorough, and I didn't mind any of it and was welcoming of any conclusion that came. But the last thing I wanted to do once I found out, here's my package of me, here's my formal diagnosis of me, was to then spend the very next bit of time dissecting all those diagnoses and becoming an expert for me in those theories, if you like, even if I know I wasn't going to be an expert. But I didn't want to intellectualize it. Intellectualizing has been is a natural strategy for me to do anything. I'm more of a thinker than a mover and doer in terms of processing, although having said that, I do process through walking and moving my body, and that's how I meditate. But it's very common for me to get into these deep, long, all-consuming mental tunnels, or intellectual tunnels, and that's not what I wanted to do at the very moment I was diagnosed as autistic, or confirmed as autistic, I should say. It also playing a part in that was the fact that along with my autism diagnosis came a diagnosis of complex PTSD and general anxiety disorder, plus I already have my ADHD diagnosis. So again, I was very tired, overwhelmed, a lot to deal with, and I felt like dealing with the mental illness was probably the first place to go, as opposed to indulging myself, if you like, for want of a better term, in the neurodiversity. Happy to say that I've got on a little bit further in my journey, and while I'm sure there's always going to be more traumatic memories and insights to process, or at least maybe not forever, but for a bit longer, there's more space in my mind and more curiosity around autism and how it manifests in me and where it comes from. And that is what's led me to delve into monotropism a bit more. Monotropism, from what I understood before reading the theory, was the tendency that I have, that's apparently classical autistic thinking, of going and diving right in and focusing in a very narrow way, but in a very deep way. So almost like a spotlight. So my attention is spotlight focused, and that is, I think that's one of the analogies that one of the authors of the monotropism theory, Dina Murray, was using, a spotlight versus a search, a torch beam that's broader. So the opposite of monotropic thinking is polytropic, and polytropism is the way that the neurotypical, or the allistic, I think it's called, world orientates itself, and their brains work. And one of the best analogies that I found came from a video from a guy called Quinn, who has I'm going to start barking dog, who has a YouTube channel the YouTube channel name, Autismatic. So Quinn, thank you on your Autismatic YouTube talking about monotropism one step at a time, he came up with the idea of saying monotropism is like having 10 attention points and you can divide them up. Now I visualised that as marbles because there's a saying, you've lost your marbles, which goes along with feeling mentally depleted or a little bit unbalanced, if you like, or mentally ill, and I've liked that analogy and found it quite comforting for all of my life so far. So I immediately thought these 10 attention points were like 10 marbles. So here it goes. So if you think of the attention, we have this thing called attention, the ability to pay attention, and humans have this ability. And say, for example, we measured our attention quota, or the maximum attention, in marbles, and we have 10 of them, for argument's sake. Now, a monotropic way of dividing up where their attention goes for any task would be to put 8 out of the 10 marbles into one container or one task. So if there's something going on, immediately 80% of my marbles, my brain capacity, my focus of attention is going into that, the narrow attention, but I've got a lot of resource in there so I can go very deeply into that narrow bit. It's only leaving me 2 attention balls or marbles for everything else, including how my body feels, what's going on around me, whether things are changing, etc. Now, if we contrast that to neurotypical, the neurotypical analogy, and of course this is only an analogy, it doesn't mean that this is exactly how it is for everyone all the time, but the neurotypical norm is to have a bit of a 50-50 split. So at any one time there might be 50% or half or 5 of your 10 marbles on the task at hand. So for example, me making this video, you know, if I'm focusing as strongly as I can as a neurotypical person in this analogy, 50% of my attention is going to making the video. The other 50% of my attention will be going to other things, including how I feel, maybe how I look, maybe how I think I'm looking compared to the image of how I want to look in my head, or something like that. There could be lots of things. What's going on outside? What time is it? What am I having for dinner? How good is the video? Whatever. Bottom line is neurotypical or allistic, a bit of a 50-50, but again, lots and lots of resources then for everything else. Now, in terms of how this might manifest in, say, the typical scenario that's given to describe monotropic versus polytropic is a conversation where maybe you're out with friends and the autistic person has gone out to meet one person, having a deep conversation, and that's all very nice, and then other people come into the conversation, leaving the autistic person a little bit stuck. I recognise this for me. I used to go out for coffee mornings when my kids were little, and there'd be multiple parents there, and I could cope with that and even enjoy that if I didn't start getting into conversations too deeply. But I enjoyed it more when I did get into a nice deep conversation along something that I found was rewarding, but it then overwhelmed me when I had to notice other things. So it's kind of like a thing. I didn't enjoy the experience as much in general, or find it was as rewarding if I didn't get into a deep conversation, and it was tiring to try and work out, well, what do I pay attention to? Am I going to try and get it? I find it hard to get into conversations or pick what to join in. I generally just sit and just, I don't really even wait. It's wrong to say wait. I just sit and, I don't know, count the wallpaper or maybe watch the dogs or whatever I'm doing. And generally I'm quite happy with that. But then I start to become a little self-conscious and because I notice other people maybe thinking, oh, is she happy or not? Should I talk to her? Anyway, long story short, that is a good scenario. That is a good understanding of what it's like being monotropic and polytropic. Polytropic, lots of people in a conversation, they can switch attention, they can say hello, they can have a little chat here, have a little chat there, and it's all sort of flowing. Doesn't necessarily mean it's easy for them or that they enjoy that. It's just, it's not so much that side of things. It's just that's how the brain's working. So the brain has the capacity to do that. Whereas for me, for the autistic monotropic experience, that is a massive mental effort to shift between one conversation and then multiples and changes of topics and whatever. My processing is all over the place. It's very difficult. It's painful almost. So that's that. So when I hadn't read the monotropic theory, I thought, and I basically assumed, I suppose wrongly, that the whole monotropic theory was about this tendency to think deeply and narrowly and get lost in sort of rabbit holes, if you like, and almost lose yourself and become in your own little world, almost like Away with the Fairies or whatever. I thought that's what monotropism was, and that was it, and that's enough. And I agreed with it. That really explained my experience and explained my strengths and my weaknesses. Of course I can, get to the bottom of something and come up with great ideas and see brilliant details and whatever, because I've got so much attention in one place versus someone who's maybe got their attention spread. And it also makes me very tired and finding very difficult doing these complex cognitive tasks of, communicating. That is all around, I've got it written on my board, task demand. So there is a concept, there is a way of describing the attention resource a task takes. It's called task demand or task demand, and that's in psychology. I think it's a psychological term or psychology term. So some tasks are more demanding than others, and demanding tasks where there's a lot of these, social and whatever cues, it can be really draining for people with autism, and I definitely agree with that. So that's what I thought monotropism was. It was describing all of that, and that's it. I read the paper, and the paper that is the key fundamental sort of keystone, if you like, of monotropism was written by Dina Murray, Dr. Wen Lawson and Mike Lesser in 2005. It was published, in 2005 in a magazine called Autism. And it was the first significant bit of work put together by people with lived autistic experience. And that's groundbreaking. That was groundbreaking. And even today, that is pretty rare. And when I say, I suppose I should put a caveat on all of this, because people who are not at school now or haven't just left school are still getting diagnosed as autistic well into their later years. It might be that a child born today will be recognised as autistic and not missed by the time, that everyone who's autistic will be picked up by the time they leave primary school or at least early secondary. But it's most common or more common for people, especially the kind of skill set, the autistic skill set that could go on to publish papers about autism, that has classically missed being included under the umbrella of autism. So the fact that we had 3 people who were adults that in 2005 in the position and with the resources and the capacity to publish a paper on autism, knowing that they were autistic, whether officially or unofficially diagnosed, was amazing and still is amazing. I think it's going to still be a few years until we're getting more and more research by people who are knowingly autistic. I do think possibly throughout the history of autism research there have been a lot of autistic people researching and publishing papers, but so I don't want to say they were the first ones, because I have a feeling that even Asperger himself and other people throughout history have had strong autistic tendencies or been actually autistic without having the capacity or the the toolkit to be diagnosed or diagnose themselves. It was, they were looking at a different lens, a different presentation. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside, but that's it. So Dina Murray, Dr. Wen Lawson and Mike Lesser published a paper in 2005, and it was called Attention, Monotropism and the Diagnostic Criteria for Autism. So this was informed by the diagnostic criteria of the day, or sort of informed by referencing, I should say, comparing it with or trying to link this. And what these 3 researchers tried to do, or these 3 individuals tried to do, is come up with a conception of the autistic experience that could then be used to inform practice, to inform treatment, communication styles, tasks, designing of tasks in educational settings or career settings or whatever. So an empowering tool for autistic people. And it did that, and I think it still does that, especially when you look at how many people on social media are singing the praises of monotropism. The bit when I read the full paper and took my notes, and I'm not for one moment thinking that I am some kind of genius here, but there seem to be, to me, a few glaringly obvious bits, and I've made a few notes on the paper. but I'm not going to go through it, every bit of it, because it gets a little bit too detailed for a YouTube video. But the bit that got me is that it centres on this idea of interest. Even without reading the sort of fundamental, the first paper on monotropism, I could have gone to Wikipedia, which a lot of people do, and read the description there. So monotropism is a cognitive strategy posited to be the central underlying feature of autism. A monotropic mind focuses on a small number of interests at any one time, tending to miss things outside this attention tunnel. Now that little snippet from Wikipedia does have a couple of very significant words in it: attention tunnel and interests. This theory focuses on, or is built around, the idea of attention, focus and interests, as in, oh, and I've written it, it's actually on my board down here, atypical or non-typical, different to the norm strategies for the allocation of attention, and that is central to autism, and that manifests in restricted range of interest and narrow focus, and all of this could be summarised as monotropic thought. So just to summarise, I had thought monotropism was a word that was used purely to describe the behavioural trends and patterns we see in autism, and it does, and it makes sense, and that was it. But then I learn it's saying you're doing these behaviours because you are choosing where your attention goes. There's a choice there, and it's based on interest and attention tunnels. And so it's kind of like, if you're really, really interested in arouse, it's about aroused interest. So if something really sort of, captures you, you're going to pay all your attention to it, go in that tunnel, and that's it. But if you don't like it, if it's not something you really want to do, you won't focus on it and won't be able to do it. Or not necessarily won't be able to do it, but it will be difficult for you. I don't think that's a trivial part. So that was built in to the very fabric of monotropic theory put forward by Dina Murray, Wen Lawson and Mike Lesser. I've looked at and listened to a few conversations and writings from autistic people and academics since, so people talking last year and blogging last year and whatever, and I haven't yet seen or heard anybody question that this is about attention. So I'm not sure whether I'm onto something or completely miss the point and doesn't matter. But this is my theory. So this is what I think monotropism is describing. I don't think it's describing a choice, conscious or otherwise, or pressured or free, around this thing called attention and whether we're aroused or not. I think that is part of what manifests as our behaviour, but I don't think that is what's causing it. I think what's causing it is to do with the brain and the brain wiring. And when I'm saying this, I'm not in any way saying that we then need to look into the brain and find the place where this is different and, oh look, that's different in there. But there might be that, but I think, again, that's not the whole thing, because me saying I think it's about the brain is me actually being wrong myself again. This is about the whole person. So let me explain myself. I'm going to explain myself by first of all telling you what I'd propose, my sort of hypothesis. So I think that reconceptualizing monotropism as a framework through which to understand autistic neurology and the whole person, the somatosensory, and I suppose the nervous system in general, rather than as a cognitive strategy, cognition around attention and around focus, which is a quality of attention. So I'm thinking that instead of, if we reconceptualize it, if we reorientate monotropism to consider, let's just say, the whole person, the whole presentation, their whole wiring, that would increase power and precision. Shifting of the theory, shifting perspective reduces the chaos and clouds all theories of cognition. Cognitive theories, so theories around what we think or pay attention to, are always going to be messy because humans are messy. And as long as humans have capacity to choose, they will choose things that make no sense. Sometimes, at least sometimes, if not often. And for some people, maybe all the time, depending on what your values are, how you're living, what your constructed reality is, and your versus your actual reality and capacity and whatever. So cognitive processes, choices, arousal, what we like and don't like, what we move towards or move away from, aren't necessarily the right way of interpreting this, because there's so many different chaotic things that can inform that. Personality traits like the big factor 5, openness to experience, conscientiousness, whatever the other, neuroticism, all of that. So we've got personality. Autistic people are not devoid of personality. We've got socioeconomic realities, how much money there is, how much stress there is, what kind of opportunities around, if you can't see it, you can't be it. Do you have a vision for yourself in the future? Do you have self-esteem? Have you been traumatized? A lot of autistic people have been traumatized, and we mustn't base autism theories on autism trauma when we're trying to empower autistic people to be the best they can be, because trauma limits us, and that could cloud what we could become. So long story short, neurological, or anything I'm talking about in terms of neurology here, I'm actually referring to the whole mind, body, the everything. So instead of thinking of it like a lot of theories, I know I'm talking around a bit, but if you look at education for a start, and Dina Murray and Wen Lawson, I think even Mike Lesser, they were involved in education in one way or another. So a lot of monotropism came about trying to find ways of teaching and empowering autistic people and working with their minds, which is very noble and a great thing, and this has been a great theory. But in educational circles, even today, let alone back in 2005, there's still this idea of the mind separate to the body, as in we just need to focus on the mind, the brain capacity, the intellectual, the IQ, intellectual quotient, whatever. What about the mind in the body and the mind, the two, the person, the whole person? I followed my thought about this. Hang on, I'll say this first. What I'm trying to put forward is, rather than say you are autistic, so you have monotropic thought processes, the monotropic thought process explains both your strengths and your struggles, which they do, but that's a circular argument. You're not actually saying anything. You're saying, well, autistic people think this way, you think this way, so therefore you're autistic. It's actually not getting us anywhere. It's not gaining us any insight. All it's doing is putting a name tag to the behaviour and then saying it's okay to be like this. You're all like this, and there's some strengths in here. That is valuable, but that's not the whole thing. I'm saying you're autistic and can think any way you choose, i.e. recognising that autistic people are not we shouldn't judge their choices. We probably don't understand why things are being chosen, and autistic people can and will choose lots of different futures for themselves and conceptions of themselves, even being extrovert, introvert, artistic, mathematical, scientific, musical, whatever they want. So instead of saying that, it's saying you're autistic and you can think any way you choose, but this is a heads up. This is how you are wired to work, and it's monotropically. There is something about your whole self that is informing you to interpret information in this sort of way. Now, the original theory might have actually meant that, but it's not what it says. And what it says, especially in a community like the autistic community where words and everything is very literal and it does matter, at least on one level, I think it's really important to broaden that definition early on so that we can have a look holistically at an individual who's autistic. And actually, monotropism through the lens of the whole person then makes sense for everybody, because this could be then a theory that could explain and explore things like peak mental performance, unlocking that hidden potential that maybe neurotypical, holistic people don't tend to tap into as easily as autistic people. So it could be that this then becomes not an autistic theory at all, but one extreme of what the brain can do in one direction that doesn't actually require a lot of task demand for someone who's autistic, but it would require a higher task demand or conscious focus for somebody who's not. So it's where we have a strength, a clear benefit, but not something that's exclusive to us. Now, why I think this is probably worth pursuing as well is if I look at neurology and brain chemistry, there's this thing in the brain called the insular cortex. And the insular cortex is a part of the brain that has been studied for processing our subjective feelings and how we respond to things. And interestingly enough for me, there's been a lot of research in this area which is focused on how this insular cortex part actually, it responds to perception more often almost than it's responding to reality. So for example, somebody says to somebody else, person A says to person B, "Hi, you're looking a bit tired today." And person B then breaks down, cries and feels terrible about themselves because they thought they looked great. You could have person A then say to person C, "Hi, you look tired today," and person C go, "You look pretty crap yourself." Have a laugh about it and walk on. What we say to each other, how we connect and relate to each other, is more than just words or patterns. It's about how we perceive interactions, and that is something I know a lot about as someone who has general anxiety disorder. I can be completely rationally aware of what's likely to happen and not likely to happen, and still have all of these perceptions and ideas and scenarios in my head that will make me or contribute to me feeling pretty tired, stressed, anxious, whatever. So to find out that this thing called the insular cortex in the brain actually responds to and is basically creating our own reality, and this involves how much pain we feel, how hot or cold, like how we interpret temperature, hot and cold, all of that kind of thing, how we show up in the world, how we sense the world, and how we make sense of the world comes through that. How one of the interesting things I found out is something that's happened in my personal life over the last few years is a close family friend of my father-in-law has developed dementia, and we were involved in we were observing that process because the person was part of our family basically until they went into a care home. So I observed the loss of skills and the loss of inhibition, and that in the early stage of the dementia that this individual had and still has. And I found it curious that because I was finding out about my autistic self at the same time as this other person was losing that side of their personality that would be the socially filtered part. So for example, you know, we went on holiday with my father-in-law, and it's actually his partner, and you know, we're in a shared house facility with another family, and his partner was unabashedly, you know, opening the fridge and taking out all the food and eating it, even though they didn't buy it, it wasn't theirs, it was the other family's, didn't think to ask or anything, just sat down and ate it. This was okay because we all understood the scenario, but that social filter, now this person would not have done that, dreamt of done that before. In fact, they'd probably be the one out getting everything and getting it ready and being the host and, you know, really entertaining us. But the tables turned because that part of the brain had become less available to them. So often when you're autistic, there's this thing that's said about us that we are a bit socially awkward, we don't read social cues, we could be embarrassing ourselves, you know, oh, look at them, they're wearing a weird thing, they said a strange thing, they didn't, you know, do what everyone's expecting. And I related to her in that moment and thought, yes, I can see the similarities. And that lack of skills comes from a part of this insular cortex. So I realise I've talked a lot about lots of different things, but monotropism, as I understood it initially, made sense to me, and it makes sense to nearly all the autistic people who talk about it on social media. So as a theory, it's becoming, again, it's almost like having its big moment, or starting to. It's on a roll. It's getting really popular. Maybe in because of that, and because of more people reading the actual theory then and coming to it, maybe a few more of us will say, hang on a minute, this isn't about a choice of attention, there's something else going on there. Even if this is stemming from the fact that maybe not just our brains but our whole body, this insular cortex isn't just dealing with our thoughts as if we're thoughts inside a non-feeling box. This is dealing with everything. Somatosensory system, where, you know, like I said, how we feel pain, pleasure, hot, cold, light touch, deep touch, massage, anything like that. So it looks to me like in the autistic presentation that there's a whole body. So we come into the world as autistic people, or autistic babies, because babies aren't people, and everything about us, every interaction we have with other people, with ourselves, with the outside world, the wind that blows across our face, the stars that we see in the sky, we are literally primed to respond to all of that differently, because our perception of it, of reality, is not typical, because we're not receiving all that information typically. That might also account for the way that a lot of us grow up feeling alien or othered, even within our own identity communities. So not like it's just hard to think of ourselves as human, because it seems that all the ways other people respond to things we don't quite resonate with. It's that resonance. I often have to remind myself and others that we are not, as autistic people, necessarily pro-socially wired at all. Some of us might be a little bit, but we're not necessarily pro-social. The opposite of pro-social isn't antisocial, it's autonomous. So I am naturally focused to attend to myself, to be self-sufficient. I don't find it a detriment to be... I don't need others. I don't need this mirroring of my emotional state in others. I don't need to read people that way. I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for other things, maybe sometimes, but you know, I'm not really looking at that. So lots and lots of words there, lots and lots of content. Some of it may have been lost in the discussion, which I didn't have because it's just me ranting. But I think the key take-home part for me is... and the reason I made this is because the monotropic theory made sense to me when I was told about it verbally by my psychologist, as in, this is the behaviour you do, this is autistic behaviour, don't feel bad about it, this is just naturally what people do, and it's why you find some other things complex. That makes sense. The official theory to me makes less sense and is less powerful because it focuses on attention, and I think that when we focus on attention, especially reading other people's, where other people's attention to, we can fall into judgments and bias, and I did notice some of that in the original paper. I noticed biases of privilege and lots of judgment about what was good and bad attention, you know. And there's an analogy that comes up in the paper that I think was from Uta Frith or something. It was another paper, and it was, you know, people with autism, weak central coherence. You know, they'll look at a forest and they'll see the trees and they'll notice the trees, but then they won't necessarily recognize that as a forest. Like they zoom in and then don't zoom out and see the whole thing. I don't think that's true. And also, I think it's a judgment, or that could have been a judgment by the people assessing that sort of perspective, because again, it's like, who's to say that that is a forest that you're conceptualizing with your 5 marbles? Maybe there's something about the forest that we're seeing that you can only see when you look at the trees. And maybe if we put our 2 perspectives together, we're going to get stronger. And if we stop fighting each other or looking for dominance or supremacy, then it can inform each other, and that would be a connection, a relationship, and then that would help my neurons fire and your neurons fire. And then maybe instead of 5, your 5 and my 8, we'd have 20 or whatever the calculation is if you put all your marbles in one bucket. Anyway, I'm digressing. This is an exciting theory. There's lots to do. I feel like this is not complete. And I feel like it's great that even the way I look at monotropic theory so far, in essentially being wrong on its first premise, it hasn't stopped it being very useful for me, and I can see it's very useful for others. So I can only imagine how exciting it's going to be if my way of looking at it is correct. Or maybe there's another way of looking at it that's even better that I haven't thought of, or slightly different. This could be amazing. And I'm really, really excited about that. And that's why I'm sharing it. So thank you. I hope it makes some sense and that I'm not just rambling into the abyss.